Even though I took the last name Florida, I never actually thought I would live in the state of Florida. I, like many other people, assumed it was a place where old people went to die, or that it was a cheesy muscle beach filled with cheesy nightclubs. But if you've been to Miami recently, it's now a luxury hotspot for the global rich and really a cultural and arts mecca. So how has Miami ignited this transformation? I'd love to welcome our next panel, Gary Wasserman from the Wasserman Projects and our friend Matt Haggman from the Knight Foundation, Miami Beach.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Matt. Rana and I have been very fortunate to watch this transformation happen in Miami. What happened was we moved to Toronto from Washington, D.C., and, well, our last name is Florida, and we made it till about January 11th, and, you know, here's a kid from New Jersey and a girl from Detroit, and we said, holy shit, this is cold. Wow. And we found a rental apartment. And we thought we'd just go on weekends and, you know, for an occasional week. And what we saw happening in Miami is quite a bit like what is, maybe it's happened a little earlier. It started before the crisis. What we saw happening there was infectious. And it was a group of creative people in arts and culture to start, bringing a new kind of outlook. And remember, I don't want to dwell on this, but Miami has not had the kinds of institutions that this great city does. I mean, it's a young city. It has not had the great arts and culture and symphonies and research institutions and colleges that this place has built up, paid for, and has been blessed with. It was really starting as a tourist place and trying to create them. So we were intrigued by what we saw and the grit, and fortunately, we bought a place when the economy was down, and that all worked out. But it's been kind of a second home for us. And I think what's nice about this conversation is we have two people, neither one who's from Miami or Miami Beach originally. Matt Haggman, who has really become a very dear friend. Matt is from Boston. We won't hold that against him. Go Tigers. No, I didn't say that. And he's from Boston and moved to Miami and worked as a journalist and was a great journalist. And then as the Knight Foundation, where he worked, began to think about, and really the whole arts and cultural revival is about the Knight Foundation. But Matt had a really interesting angle. And his angle was Miami has a lot of fun. It has great weather, it has a great cultural scene, but it doesn't have a lot of work, right? It doesn't have a lot of stuff. People can come there like us who make money elsewhere. How can we build work? Let's build an entrepreneurial community. And Matt's going to tell you, he has been, in my mind, the most successful person at nurturing that startup ecosystem, facilitating that startup ecosystem, not him, building a network of other people. He's going to tell you about that. And also joining us is Gary Wasserman. Gary is a native son. His family were industrialists here. He's lived here in this city. He's been involved in this city, and we lived in the same building in Miami Beach. We don't any longer. Gary's moved on to bigger and better things, but he's even doing something really phenomenal here. Wasserman Projects, bringing a state-of-the-art, first-class art gallery into the downtown core, alongside many other parts of that artistic and cultural revival. And I think what I'd like Gary to talk about in a second is also help us compare. We all know, Matt knows because the Knight Foundation has an office here, but let's try to draw a contrast. And so Matt, let's start with you. Well, how did you do it? I mean, I think you're the secret sauce. And if we could clone you and put you in 50, 100 metros. But really, when you started this, and we met literally when you started just several years ago, what did you see in Miami? And then how did you get it to this level with the startup companies and all of the excitement in this urban area of Miami? So Tell us a little bit about that story of that transformation.
Sure, absolutely. And Richard, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and with Rana, and really appreciate the kind remarks. All our work at Knight Foundation in Miami around entrepreneurship started when we actually first met. So it's just been terrific to have been on this journey with you and with Rana. So, it was about 3.5 years ago, I left the Miami Herald, where I was a reporter, and joined Knight Foundation. And our CEO said, at Knight Foundation, we work in the arts, we work in journalism and media innovation, we work in trying to improve cities across the country. And in Miami, our CEO said to me, he said, okay, go talk to people. Our CEO, Alberto Ibargüen, said, go talk to people and come back in 4 months and tell me what we should do next in Miami. Right? Our mission is promoting informed and engaged communities. What should be that next thing for Knight Foundation alongside our work in the arts and journalism, media innovation? And so came back 4 months later, thereabouts, and said, look, I really think there's an opportunity around entrepreneurship. And so in looking around at Miami, a city whose roots are as a retiree and vacation destination, the thought was our city has changed in some really important and fundamental ways, and we have some trends that we can really leverage to build community. Number one, how international Miami had become, right? Miami, of course, when it first got started, was just another sort of southern city, in this case, at the tip of the peninsula. Right? It had changed dramatically. Miami's now a place where more than half the population is foreign-born. More than 3/4 of Miami residents come from someplace else. Then, in addition, on top of being so international, we've seen, of course, you already referred to it, this whole arts renaissance that we've seen take hold in Miami, both at sort of a very high level in terms of things like Art Basel coming to Miami. At an institutional level, we've seen since in the last 9 years, 4 different cultural institutions build new homes in Miami. So this remarkable shift, but also in terms of, also just on the grassroots level, where we're seeing neighborhoods revitalize around the arts. And then on top of that, we also thought about, over the last 10 years, there's been an amazing change in terms of Miami, a city that post-war became a sprawling, no there city, found urban density. We were very fortunate that we had a mayor for 8 years in the city of Miami who really pushed hard to rebuild the urban core. And now Miami has seen over the last 6 to 7 years, a doubling of the downtown population. It's about to grow on itself again. So it really has this really important density that it so long lacked. So international, culturally alive, urban density. And then as we looked around, and something that even Miamians themselves didn't really appreciate, it's among the most entrepreneurial metropolitan areas in the entire US. In fact, Kaufman does a study called the Index of Entrepreneurial Activity. Kaufman Foundation does this study, and Miami, each of the last 5 years, has been top 5 per capita among all cities across the country. In the most recent report that came out about 3 weeks ago, Miami ranked number 2 after Austin. Most Miami residents aren't even aware of that. Right? So the thought was, okay, if we put all of this together, this is a really interesting picture, but there are some problems to solve. Miami companies aren't scaling like they should. There are enormous disconnects in terms of where we have successes, we don't see the ripple effects and the multipliers. So our thought in looking around is that Knight Foundation would be helpful, spending foundation dollars, trying to help build the ecosystem, create the places for entrepreneurs to gather and share, create the mentor and funder networks, create a rich variety of events of different kinds to create connections and sense of community and all of that. And so that's what we've been up to.
Just a couple minutes, though, on what you said at the end, to tell people, because they're trying to do it here, and the Detroit has its other assets, but it doesn't have what's happened in the past 3.5 years. When you looked around, I've seen Lab Miami, Endeavor Miami, I've seen some of the events, we're partnered in some of the events you've done. What is that secret sauce? And building that, one of the things it seems to me that you did is take a whole bunch of people who really didn't know one another, who were off doing their own thing, and make them a community. And then one last thing, when I look at the entrepreneurial community in Miami, I don't necessarily see tech. I do see tech, but I see food and beverage, I see restaurant, I see music and popular culture, I see lifestyle and health, I see juice and fitness, a whole bunch of things other than what we usually think of as a high-tech company. So 2 things. What were maybe the first things you did to establish that and then grow it? And how has that 3.5-year process gone It's overnight. How have you accelerated that process of building that community?
I want to highlight really two things. Number one of the big problems we saw to solve was just that, as you point out, there are lots of different things happening, but they're all happening in isolation. So lots of silos. So our first thought was we need to lower barriers and create connections from the grassroots. It can't be institutional top down. So one of the first things we funded was just a pure co-working space called the Lab Miami. There wasn't much in terms of co-working at the time in Miami. Now suddenly there's a lot. In fact, tomorrow, WeWork, one of the largest co-working operators in the world, will be opening its first office in Miami, which is a nice sort of validation that we think we're on the right track. But in addition, I really want to point out and really highlight, particularly Joanna Harries, who you just had the good fortune of seeing on this panel. We brought in Knight-provided funding to launch Endeavor Miami, which is the very, very first U.S. affiliate of Endeavor. Endeavor's in more than 20 countries around the world. And there was a lot of debate within Endeavor about whether or not coming to the U.S. and launching the U.S. made sense. And Joanna was one of the really, really big advocates to do that. And not only that, she was the person on the ground who built the Endeavor Miami office, built the local board. And that was key, because while we're trying to seed the grassroots, we really needed the sort of, what do you call it, sort of those tent poles, so to speak, right? Those things that we can all rally around and aspire to. And Endeavor serves as that by being that organization that spots those high-impact, high-potential entrepreneurs, and then can help them become stars, and then do what all communities in this space are trying to do, and that's create that pay-it-forward network. Create an environment where you can not only create stars, but turn those stars into funders and mentors, the next group coming up, and creating that multiplier effect.
And think about this, doing this in a place without the asset base, the great institutions, the great universities. And I think that the disadvantages there is that was missing. The advantage there is you didn't have a choice.
Well, there was no
if you wanted to work, you had to build something because there weren't all of these large companies.
Well, there was no history really to sort of reinvent from. It's sort of a different story than the story here in Detroit, where there's this glorious history, right? And then it's now then the Renaissance, as we sort of the recovery from that. Whereas Miami, there's really no history to begin from. So it's the whole sort of ethos of the place is you're sort of that. Please go ahead.
And we'll get to this. And Miami is poorer. It has less of a creative class, fewer knowledge workers, and a bigger divide when you think about haves and have-nots. So it's been done in conditions that, if anything, there were some asset base, but in conditions that were even more potentially onerous on the downside. Gary, you know both towns pretty well. I mean, you're from here, you know Miami pretty well, and you not only that, but there's two intersections. You also intersect the business world, the industrial world, and the arts and culture world. So in your view, just at the most basic level, how do you compare the levels of transformation, the levels of development, the levels of revitalization, and how do you kind of think these two, not necessarily measure up, but how do they compare and contrast Miami and Detroit with one another?
It is obviously impossible to say that they are comparable because climatically the difference is obvious. But as a child, we would go to Miami at holidays. And then came the time about the end of the 50s, early 60s, where it was possible to go other places. Miami had the problem of the Mariel boat lift. It had become a dangerous place where it had been a sleepy southern town. It became an angry southern town, and people stopped going there. Simultaneous, there was a slippery slope that had begun here. By the end of the 50s, I always like to say, were Detroit's peak. That was the moment of the greatest exuberance of the auto industry. That was the 1959 Cadillac was the one with the big fins and the huge lights. That was, and from there, it all started to fall apart. So both of these cities, which actually had a great deal to offer in, let's say, much more provincial ways, it wasn't a globalized world, they lost their footing, they lost their confidence, they lost their pride, they lost everything. And Miami began to find a way back, obviously, some years ago. Detroit is now finding its way back. I like to say, relative to Detroit, that Detroit is not having a renaissance or a comeback. Detroit and cities like Detroit are the new frontier of the 21st century.
Same thing.
Detroit's not going to be Chicago or Toronto. It's not even going to be Detroit. It's going to be some new urban experience, and that's the adventure, that's the fun of being involved here, and it is surely what brought me back here after having been primarily in Florida for about 18 years. Miami today, as it grows, is following the more conventional urban growth model of you build a building, it creates demand, you build the next building, it raises the value of the first building, and on it goes. Detroit is following I'm also a Jane Jacobs groupie, it is following the Jane Jacobs idea of a city as a fabric made of individual threads that together become a community. It is not about monolithic Renaissance centers or stadia. It's about individual businesses, attractions, neighborhoods, all of which become threads in this urban fabric. For Miami, the moment, I think, of enormous transformation was the first Art Basel Miami Beach. With that moment came a newfound excitement and pride in this place, which had been all about partying, and now all of a sudden thought, oh, we can be kind of serious too. Detroit's moment perhaps was less glittering, but Detroit's moment was the bankruptcy, which created this new stage for a new city to be born. In Miami, the cultural confidence that came from Art Basel has also been followed by what Matt referred to in this really robust expansion of museums, new museums, existing museums. The project perhaps closest to my heart is the Cleveland Orchestra Miami Residency, which is a model in the cultural world of the way that a major iconic institution can exist in a shrinking northern economy by licensing itself to a more robust southern economy.
I have to tell you this story. I went to the little taco stand on 16th Street, and I saw these two guys sitting there eating tacos. And they were dressed pretty casually. And I heard them talking about their union. And I was for sure they were day laborers. And I asked them what they did. And they said, oh, I'm a cellist in the Cleveland Symphony. I'm a violinist in the Cleveland Symphony. And we love our residency here. And I think that speaks to a lot of things, that little story about having a good wage that you really care about matters. One thing that you mentioned, the frontier, Gary, and I actually like this idea. You know, America was built at the frontier. We first moved west. We then moved to the suburbs. Ken Jackson called it the crabgrass frontier. Now our new frontier is places. You're absolutely right, like Detroit. So Matt, the thing that I want to talk about, and we'll come back to you, Gary, Miami has been successful in building this entrepreneurial community. It has been successful in building this creative thing. But boy, you know, we talk about it, is it divided? You know, you go 2 blocks off the waterfront, and you see homeless people, and you see tent cities. And I know we're still getting there as a country, but where do you think we could start? And I know you think about this a lot. Where do we start to make sure that we're not just building glittering cities for the super creatives and the entrepreneurs, but that we build an inclusive kind of urban rebuilding?
Yeah, this is something we've been thinking a lot about in our work in Miami around entrepreneurship. And the thing that we keep coming back to is that actually it's that for this effort in Miami in particular to be successful, it really needs to be about all of Miami. And that the more that we can create the ways in which, as we sort of try and build out this ecosystem, the more that we can create ways in which people from different economic backgrounds, different life stories, different personal biographies, different daily challenges and concerns can connect and collide, the better. Because ultimately, the richer the set of the ideas, and ultimately, the greater the impact. So certainly one of the things we're trying to do, because there's enormous income disparity in Miami, like many cities, but it's certainly very, very pronounced in Miami. But so one of the things we're trying very, very hard to do in our work is to create opportunities as we create places and mentor and funder networks where to try and connect throughout the community. That includes co-working spaces in underrepresented communities. That includes creating something called the Idea Center at Miami-Dade College, which is the largest and most diverse community college in the US. It actually no college graduates more Black and Hispanic students in the country. And creating a way in which we're sort of incubating entrepreneurs, creating that sense of possibility at an early stage, and then connecting to this broader network. But it's something that this is a long game and something that needs to be worked on every day because we see it. We even see it, in Miami Beach, but we see it, of course, across Greater Miami. And for all of this to work, we must confront it and solve it.
And I think the way to solve that is the local level. I think as much as I'd like to believe we can address these questions at the national level, our country is so divided and gridlocked. I do think it's at the local level. And I think it's this combination of entrepreneurship that, and I hate to call it mom and pop, but I wrote in the book, The Machine Shop versus the Hair Salon. When I asked my students where they would rather work, almost every person would rather work in a hair salon, build their hair salon, build that business, be successful. And I think that is an idea that so many new immigrants to this country have. So I think it's scaling this and also making sure those jobs and services and hospitality and tourism get upgraded.
Absolutely. I mean, just putting it very, very simply, the costs to create continue to drop. So the ability to act in sort of big transformative ways is going up dramatically. And so the more ways that we can create that, spread that opportunity more broadly, the more hopefully we create greater opportunities for economic growth.
And the one thing you have in Miami, they're not great jobs, but you do have a lot of jobs in hospitality and tourism on cruise lines. And I remember the best criticism I ever got on my work in the creative class was a young man from Austin who wrote and said, yeah, you totally misunderstand Austin's creative scene. It's all because we can work at Whole Foods and we get a real paycheck and we can make money, but we can do our creative stuff and build our businesses at night. So I think this, between having a robust economy and good jobs. Gary, you mentioned something offhandedly. You said what drew you back here. I heard this. You said there was something after 18 years away which impelled you to be back here. What is it?
So I had been, for many years, deeply involved in Detroit's cultural institutions and even politically. And at a certain point, I was very frustrated, and I thought, I have this great house on the beach in Florida. I don't need this. And I was kind of like the guy who can work during the day and do whatever he wanted at night. So a friend who was a very significant gallerist from Paris came and asked me to help her with a project in Detroit because she had heard about all of these wonderful things happening here. And I had heard of it, and I thought, oh my God, I've heard so many comebacks, I've heard so many renaissances. But I needed to be here that summer anyway. And when I came back here, it was, I'd like to say, I didn't just drink the Kool-Aid, I took a deep dive. Because it was like a made-for-TV movie. What I like to tell people is if you come to Detroit, don't look for cranes. Go to Miami if you want to see cranes. If you come to Detroit, you have to look to see the ground bubbling and listen carefully for where those bubbles are coming from. It's not that obvious, but it's here. There is such energy. There is such a sense of community and mission and dedication. It is completely motivating to want to invest oneself fully in seeing that through.
Just to follow up on that, even from someone who has, I've only had the good fortune to be in Detroit just a couple of times, but the Detroit story, just to build on what Gary said, is something in Miami that frankly is a real source of inspiration. It's that the resiliency that has been shown here is something that we talk a lot about. So just so you all know, even as you may be in the trenches every day, grappling with various challenges here, it's a story that really resonates, and we talk about it a lot in Miami, and is actually a real source of inspiration.
One can argue that New York City has been resilient in the wake of the Trade Center attack, in the wake of the financial crisis, in the wake of two major hurricanes. But boy, oh boy, it's starting from a pretty good base. And even compared to many of the other cities I mentioned, Detroit has proven incredibly resilient. I mean, to take this kind of body blow in a major sector, the auto sector, and with it, so many of the good jobs that created a middle class here, to be able to absorb that as a region, not so much as a city, as a metro region, and to actually continue to grow population, to reinvent that economy. And I always say, when you get to this scale, 5+ million people crossing a border to Canada, big metro airport that's a global hub, plus all of this research and development, it really is a base to build on that few, combined with that resiliency. And I think the other advantage is this incredible diaspora that I don't want to call you part of a diaspora because you never really left, but if you...
No, I was.
But if you look at us and Rana and I, and you look at the incredible amount of people who don't leave and say, the hell with it, I'm done with it. Many places people leave and say, my grandparents, when they left Southern Italy, I don't want to go back, the heck with that, I don't want to ever see that place again. I think you're right, there's a pull and a tug that is truly, and even when maybe you got fed up with it, I'm not saying you did, but even when you throw in your hat, you can't quite get it out of your system.
I think there is a very interesting anthropological aspect to all of this. My parents and my grandparents' generation built this city, its industries, and its institutions, and at some point they felt robbed of that legacy. My generation never came to the party. I was pretty much alone when I was involved in these civic institutions, at least among my own peers who said, why are you doing that? Who cares? And I cared, but ultimately it became so difficult.
Great, I'd like to thank both of you guys. This has been an incredible conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.